and quickly in terms of when I'm talking is relative, but I do think that there'll be time to chat. That's actually what I'm more interested in to some degree. So I like this because I know Roy, and he just retired. So Roy Tennant, wrote the thing a long time ago about how Mark being dead. So Roy just retired this year, and so obviously Mark isn't. And I put question marks on it because I'm not sure when it actually ever will. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by that. Because one of the things I struggled with a little bit was thinking about how do you talk about the future of metadata, because we've had lots of futures of metadata, actually, if you think about it, and lots of efforts that we've put into to try and kill Mark, and I sometimes don't even like even thinking about it in terms of killing Mark, because the reality is there's a lot of what we end up doing when we talk about whether Mark needs to die or, we talk about it just in general, is we tend to conflate a format that was essentially made to transfer data from one place to another with the actual rules, the interpretations, and the language that we use for describing and doing cataloging. It's actually fairly easy to separate Mark from the cataloging practice that we do, and we do it all the time. You don't realize it, but you don't catalog in Mark when you work with Connection, assuming you work with Connection. Connection doesn't store anything in Mark. It stores it in OCLC's XML-based format. It's Mark-like. It interprets it into Mark when it goes into WorldCat. MarcEdit doesn't use Mark when it stores data internally. It uses its own internal format. I work on a discovery project at Ohio State University. We are not using Mark. We're not using BibFrame. We're using a format that meets our particular needs, that incorporates different types of semantic web concepts into it to allow us to be able to meet our particular use case around discovery. So when I think about, what's the future of cataloging, I think about, we've had this discussion a couple of different times. There was Dublin Core, which OCLC was involved in, MarcXML, which was just somebody asked on the listserv, why aren't we using that? Schema.org, which seems to make a lot of sense if the reality is that we're looking to create something that people who aren't librarians can work with. And then there's kind of the current work around BibFrame, which is kind of the current effort that's happening around libraries, thinking about how we create a new data model and framework to represent bibliographic data inside of this new world. And what does that mean for cataloging? And it's an interesting kind of problem. So I want to talk about the things we agree on and then maybe the things we don't agree on. So I think that some of the things that we can all agree on is that right now, and this actually isn't a right now thing. I think we lose perspective sometimes. Libraries have always seemed to be in a period of significant change, particularly around how we manage library metadata. At least in the 20 years, and I cannot believe I've been working in libraries for 20 years, I remember when I would go to conferences and I was the youngest person in the room. And it always felt really interesting. Now I go to these coding conferences and I am not even close. And it's really weird. But we can all agree, we live in a time that's likely marked with significant change and will continue to be marked with significant change. So in the time that I was a cataloger, from 1999 to 2007, when I was actively cataloging in MAPS, I had to learn how to catalog in FUGC. I had to learn to catalog in Dublin Core. I had to work in MarcXML. I had to work with XSLTs, and I had to work with Mark. And Mark changed from AACR2 to something that eventually became RDA. So there's constantly this state of flux going on, and we in no way, shape, or form will ever, in any way in this world, live in a place with some kind of bibliographic homogeny. It just isn't going to happen. I still work with a lot of institutions where their catalogs have just as many pre-AACR2 records as they have RDA records. And it's just the way it is. But we are going to be in this time. And part of the reason we're going to be in this time is because, right now we all agree that we should be doing something more. We think we should be doing something more. Mark, which we use in most of our systems, was based in 1968. It solved a very specific problem. We got to be, it would seem like we should be able to do something else. The other thing I think we can all agree on, because I hear this all the time in the technology conferences I go to, is that unless you work in technical services, MARC has become kind of a bit of a dirty word. Nobody wants to talk about metadata in MARC. In fact, I hear all the time about how difficult it is to work with MARC. And it's true. It is a bit of a quirky little format to work with. The character encoding that we work with is understood by nobody outside of libraries. And there are lots of different flavors, national flavors to it. So even though I get a MARC record and I could read it in my system directly, the data that's there may not actually be what I think it is. You guys know that more than anybody because you probably have to deal with Unimarc on a regular basis. No? Okay. I deal with Unimarc on a regular basis. And it confuses the heck out of me because I don't know anything about it other than that it reads into MARC. But it's actually incredibly flexible. Most people don't realize this, but MARC records can have 9 indicators. They have fields that are longer than three variables. They can be alphanumeric. You can have up to 9 indicators. There's actually a lot of stuff that you can do. We just don't do it in our systems. It's used in niche communities, and this is one of the things that, that folks have a problem with. But I don't think people realize that MARC is actually used farther than libraries. Most people don't realize this, but in the mapping community, Z39.50 was the protocol that we used to create hybrid searching within our geoscience community for a very long time. And so even though we tend to think of this as only a libraries kind of thing, there are a lot of technologies that we use that are tied up with our current metadata practice that are actually used or have been traditionally used outside of other places. It's historically string-based, and this is a problem, especially as we start thinking about how we improve discovery. But I say historically because that's changing. So as we think about this transitional period, one of the things that is happening in the PCC and in other groups like mine is they're approaching the group that manages the MARC format and are making changes to be able to start including URIs into data records. Now, we may not all agree on how these URIs should be printed, and I definitely don't agree, even though I'm on some of these groups, in terms of how we're going about doing it, because I think it creates, some of the ways that we're doing this is creating confusion, I think, and will in the future. But we are right now in the process of creating MARC records that are more object-based than string-based in a lot of the parts of the records, especially around name authorities, around potentially titles, around subjects. Most records that I work with now, when we go into our discovery tool, we can reconcile all the main entries. We can reconcile most of the information about those works. We can reconcile the subjects. We can create local endpoints to our local subject vocabulary endpoints. And we can build all of that and use it within our discovery interface. And that's just using MARC records. It's also misunderstood. I think that one of the things that I do always point out when I talk to folks, particularly library programmers, when I talk about MARC, because folks tend to, the programmers tend to equate MARC with the cataloging rules, as they're really different. Like I said, it was really designed to do something else. Some things that some people won't agree on. So I think, personally, even though it's from 1968, that MARC is actually incredibly diverse. And it's because I work with it on a regular basis around the world. So people forget there are roughly about 50 different national flavors of MARC that encompass a wide variety of character encodings, just like MarcEdit, that don't exist anywhere else, that work within, that work with and support libraries around the world. And I find it interesting because even though I may not be able to take a record that's, say, in Chinese MARC and load it into my catalog and get exactly what I think I should get out of it, I can load it into my catalog. I can read it in anything that understands MARC, and I can update and change the records and work with it in a way that I can't do it in other formats. There's a technical footprint that supports use cases for all libraries. And this is actually something that I worry a little bit about. I'm going to get to this later in terms of where we're going in the future. So because I work with MarcEdit, I get the opportunity to work with a lot of libraries. So I do work with a lot of R1s. I work in an R1, so Research 1 institution. I don't know if that's what you call them here. Okay, so we tier our research institutions. So we're in an R1, large research institution. And so those groups tend to have a lot of resources. You know, the folks behind a lot of semantic web stuff, they're folks that we would consider R1, Stanford, Cornell, the folks that have a lot of money, more money than they know what to do with, that are putting money into doing this kind of stuff. We also have a lot of small institutions, small medical libraries, we have a lot of public libraries, and I still work with a lot of countries where I am actually mailing disks back and forth when I work with them in order to help them work with their metadata on their records. Marc actually supports that because it's such a small footprint. The amount of data that you pass back and forth to the Marc record usually runs the neighborhood of about 2K. It actually works really well over microwave line, something that is much more difficult to accomplish in an XML-based format. Some other things I think we can agree with. I do think at some point libraries have to move on from Marc. It makes a lot of sense, and there are very few things we've used since 1968 that look exactly the same way. What does that look like? I don't know. Is it going to be BibFrame as it looks like today? Probably not. You remember we're on BibFrame 2.0, and there's still things in the model that we're still adjusting and trying to get right. So there probably will be something else. Very likely it'll be designed around web standards. It's very likely going to include semantic web concepts, assuming that that's still what the web looks like. And it's probably going to be designed still to be understood by a very small niche number of users. And this is something that I know is some folks would not agree with. But I can tell you from working with the BibFrame format as it is now, I've taken records, handed them to my computer scientists, and asked them, can you do something with these? And the answer is, I can read the formats, but from a conceptual side, I still have no idea what these records mean. So there's still a lot of domain knowledge tied to being able to work with this metadata records. If the idea is we're going to create data sets that are going to be easier to be used by folks who are not in libraries, to some degree they are because they're in XML, but by and large the data itself doesn't become any easier for people to understand. And I'll be honest, we were talking about this earlier, I've read the new RDA rules that are being applied, particularly as they're being applied into BibFrame, and I don't understand them very well. And so I wouldn't expect my CS folks to understand them. As far as catalogers are concerned, I think it really has to do with how we develop interfaces to support what catalogers need to do. Whether that's BibFrame, whether that's Marc, whether that's whatever comes next. As long as catalogers are able to understand within the language that they're going to speak, the metadata rules that they're working with, I don't think it actually matters what the framework is underneath it. We see this now already. I mentioned connection. Connection doesn't store data in Marc. It will read Marc, but it doesn't actually store anything in Marc. The connection data file in the back end is actually an access database that stores an XML file internally that's in, what is it, CDF? Is that what the acronym is?
No, about connection.
Okay. So there's a specific XML format that they use underneath, and so that's how MarcEdit interacts with connection. BibFrame, there's a BibFrame plugin that allows it to read it. It reads the XML format, translates it into Marc, blah blah blah. Like I said, MarcEdit doesn't use Marc underneath, not even the mnemonic format. The tools themselves can actually help support and bridge for catalogers, whatever it is that the format ends up looking like. And I think that that's hard right now to kind of understand, because right now, if you're following the Bib framework, the editors that they're working on are really interesting, but they would not be good for production work. I mean, they do a single record. If you were trying to do any kind of batch record work that doesn't exist, it's just a very different model, and partly because they're starting from scratch. So what are the problems? So I have specific things that I'm concerned about when I think about where we're at, and when I think that we'll be able to start actually having real conversations about what cataloging looks like in whatever the environment looks like next. And the problems actually come from three things, I think. And so one of them is legacy investment. And I'm actually not thinking about this in context of legacy investment of library data that's in MARC. So there is a large set of data that's in MARC, but I actually think that that's a solvable problem. Converting data from MARC to something else actually is not that hard to do. I've done it a couple times. In my catalog, I have 7 million records at Ohio State. I've gone through the process of reconciling all of it into semantic web concepts and converting it all to BibFrame 2. Didn't take that long. Took about 2 months. Easy to process. Now, can I do anything with it right now? Maybe. What I end up doing is I end up putting it somewhere else. But the actual conversion of the legacy data is a solvable problem. The actual problem that we have is the legacy investment around library tools, library systems, and practices and language that's designed around what we use with MARC. And the RDA work that we're doing right now is actually kind of the first step in trying to break kind of the language legacy part. Because it becomes really difficult. And I see this when I try and talk about some of the work that's happening in that community. It's just different, very different than what I did when I was working in cataloging. But because of that legacy problem, the thing that I worry about a lot is this fractured metadata community that might happen. So libraries have worked together and moved together as a group. So when RDA happened within MARC, it didn't matter whether I used it or not. The data that I created, I could still use. Whether you created RDA and I didn't, I could still bring it into my catalog because the structures were still the same. There were ways for me to work around things that maybe didn't work. If you consider something like a transition to BibFrame, in a world where libraries, especially R1 libraries and national libraries, start transitioning into that format, you start creating a metadata community that starts leaving people behind, a significant number of people behind. First, you end up having the large R1s and the research libraries, the national libraries, and then everybody else is kind of in that second tier. When you get people caught up, you end up having something like North American, maybe European libraries, and then another large break. And the question is, will that break ever come back together? There has to be enough. Demonstrated. Can't find words been up too long. There has to be an actual need, a problem that has to solve, and I'm not quite sure yet in the initial sets of what we're working on that there's enough of that being able to be displayed. This one is an interesting one. The necessary infrastructure doesn't exist, and this is actually one that actually frightens me a lot because I realize that Ohio State and every library will have to be part of this infrastructure in order for something like BibFrame or a metadata format that's distributed in order to work. The concept behind BibFrame is a good one. It's this notion that metadata is distributed. I don't have to have a full record in my system. I have links out to all these different places that have representations of those objects. But in order for that to work, I have to have the infrastructure available to that. So within the MARC records, there are local data fields right now that have subjects that we host at Ohio State University. That means in order to work within a BibFrame environment, I have to reconcile those subjects and host in a namespace those vocabulary elements. I have to be able to provide that infrastructure for the world. I don't see that happening, at least not right now. In fact, I run the infrastructure. I know it's not happening right now. But that happens at a much broader concept. So right now, we're building infrastructure based on what I consider really fragile nodes. So a lot of what we do right now is based around Library of Congress and LCSH, at least in the United States. It's built around their U.S. national libraries, like the medical library, which handles mesh subject headings. We have OCLC, which is doing things like VOF. And then we have places like the Getty and some other folks like that. The problem is these folks are really fragile. So the U.S. Library of Congress, I wouldn't trust them, honestly, as a node on the infrastructure, as an infrastructure node. It's because they're not a national library. Congress could change their mission tomorrow and decide to do something else. And in fact, they have actually in the past removed a semantic web, endpoint that was initially created for experimentation to replace it with what they have now. the U.S. Medical Library that does mesh headings, they have a really nice setup, but they will tell you up front that it's not set up for production work. You can query it for reconciliation, but in a distributed network where they're relied on to be a endpoint that's constantly being hit, they just don't have those resources. And OCLC is an interesting one because they're cooperative. Their goal and their job and their mission is to help libraries, all libraries. But at the end of the day, they're a membership co-op. And somebody has to pay for the infrastructure. And I've talked to OCLC a number of times. This isn't cheap. In order to become an infrastructure point, you can't be a pipe on the infrastructure for just members. You have to be someone for everybody. So in order for libraries to be able to create the necessary infrastructure, it actually means libraries have to get out of it. In order for libraries to, I think, create something like BibFrame that relies on a distributed network of infrastructure, libraries actually will have to give up all of their authority control and rely on tools probably like Wikidata or something like that that actually lives outside of our control, that actually has the infrastructure available to do it. I'm not quite sure libraries are ready to do that, or just people in general. And then the last one is one that I think that is true, but I know that folks who fund libraries would disagree, but it's true, that the profession really doesn't value metadata, not in the way that it needs to in order for something like this to happen. To make the changes that we need to shift libraries beyond MARC and to consider something like BibFrame, or semantic web work, or to do the kind of tool development work that we need to do. Right now it relies on essentially 3 or 4 institutions to do that. There are 3 or 4 institutions that we rely on heavily to do the development work for this stuff to happen. And in fact, it makes me nervous in a lot of communities. We work in our digital infrastructure. We use the Samvera product. We use Hyrax. You know, a lot of that work is dependent on Stanford staying interested in that project. A lot of the work that happens in these new projects, like the Folio project, are happening because there are a handful of large institutions that are essentially propping these projects up, hoping at some point that the community will pick them up. And historically, that's not been something that's happened within the library community. We've historically not been good at that. And it's going to be really difficult to do because it's going to cost real resources in a place where libraries are trying to figure out ways to pay less to create more and better metadata. We outsource a lot of it. Too few libraries really understand the value of good metadata and the role it plays. And in that kind of an environment, I'm skeptical that our profession, even if the legacy and the infrastructure problems were solved, would be able to provide the necessary transition to do skills, systems conversions, and all the different things that would need to be used to do new metadata models. And so that's a little bit depressing. So it feels like to me, in some ways, that what we're doing right now, we're having a lot of conversations. We're spending an awful lot of money. At least a number of folks are spending a lot of money on research, trying to think about what these new metadata concepts might look like. And essentially we're creating a process that puts it just out of reach for a lot of people to participate in. I hear from a lot of folks that would like to understand and be more involved in some of these communities, but the problem is that in order to participate, there's a price of entry. And a lot of that has to do with, is your organization big enough to be able to participate? So what does that mean for the things that we should be doing here? So I like to think locally when I think about how I work with and think about how I scope how I'm going to address metadata changes and how I'm going to introduce these at my organization, as well as how I think about how I work with them in MarcEdit, where I have a large community that I'm also trying to bring along with things. And I think about this in a couple of different ways, and one of them is to try and be disruptive. So there are ways to be disruptive within your organization without having to commit your organization too deeply in projects that maybe they aren't particularly comfortable in. For us, that was actually our discovery project. So the library had been having, we had been using WorldCat Local as our discovery tool, and apologies to CLC folks, that was not very good. And we were having significant issues being able to help users be able to find things that the library held, both our digital collections, our library website. We basically wanted to put everything together. That meant having to answer a couple of really interesting questions. And when we started looking at what would be the approach for doing this, we had a couple of different ways to go about doing this. One would be to take an easy approach and to use something like Blacklight and try and just shove it all in there and use Blacklight as our process for working through it. But to be honest, there was a part of us, there was a part of me that didn't want to just create a separate silo that was going to be worked on. The other part was to think about how we could use this as a way to think about this as a research project, to use some of the concepts that are being discussed in the BibFrame communities in a way that actually meets a need that we have. And so that was what we ended up doing. We took about 7 months and created a platform around the library. So rather than solving a discovery problem, we decided to solve a data problem. We took all of the different sources that we had, all of the different silos that live in libraries, and our libraries love silos. I don't know about your guys' libraries. My library loves silos. We have a lot of silos everywhere of data. Rather than trying to get rid of those, we decided to create a platform on top of them and document the API for how people got them. What that meant is having to normalize all of that metadata into something else. So we ended up creating a metadata framework that was semantic web friendly, but in no way as complicated as BibFrame because it didn't meet my user need. I didn't need it, but I needed some parts of it. And so we created something that was more of an agnostic data schema that we could bring content in and make use of the semantic web concepts that maybe were in MARC records that we were creating, that we were using to create URIs to resources. It's not truly distributed because we're actually going out and pulling data from those resources and caching it locally rather than having a more of a truly distributed environment. But that's because it meets our needs for discovery. And so we took something to solve a particular problem and then decided to be disruptive about it. And what that ended up meaning was we were actually able to solve 2 problems. The first one was the discovery problem, which we're still working on. There are things that are hard to find. Obviously, because some have good metadata and some don't. But what we actually solved, which was the problem that, I'll be honest, I wanted to solve because it takes the most of my time, is my users at the institution are doing more digital humanities work. I needed to turn the library into a data hub in a way that we couldn't before. And so by creating a platform and creating an agnostic data format that included some of these semantic characterizations and a well-documented API, I could open the library up in a way that I couldn't in the past to people who need to extract metadata, who need to pull the content from the library, who want to create their own portals around the library's resources. And then I can use my platform to normalize out all of the ugliness that happens inside of library metadata, inside of negotiating with vendors, inside of proxying data. Being a network pipe. So I told you that Ohio State has data. We think we need to be a network pipe, but we're not right now. We're going to. We've realized that if we're going to participate in this semantic world and understand that the infrastructure that we need is going to be very much borne by local institutions. There will be large national organizations that have to be these large data network pipes. But if you think about all of the different subjects and names and local information that you use as access points, those are yours. You're going to have to be the one to maintain those, which means you're the one that's going to have to manage the pipes. And so part of it is thinking about how do we take the data that we're responsible for and start creating our own URIs that are able to be reconciled for wherever people are using them. And what structure and what does that mean for us in terms of resources? It definitely costs us resources. We've been starting to think about what this means if in, say, for example, we have a very large cartoon library, Billy Ireland Cartoon Library Museum. They have their own vocabulary that's used in other institutions. if we were going to become the semantic web pipe, what does that mean in terms of our own resource allocation that we're going to need? And it's actually substantial, because it means that every search, every resource view is going to touch that endpoint. And so it means trying to figure out what that means for our own local institution and where we do that. We're starting to put these up so that locally we have access to them. We're not at this point ready to start telling other people to use them, because honestly I'm slightly terrified people will knock them down the same way I used to when I would work with national libraries, who would tell me, yeah, we've got a linked data endpoint, reconcile your data against it, and within a couple hours I'd have their service down. And so, I'd like to avoid that and try and figure out a way to scale this up slowly. The other one here is documentation. So we have been, at my institution, notoriously bad at documenting everything that we do. Just the way that it works. We are busy trying to get work done. And as we start working on these kind of projects, one of the things that we realized, because we end up redoing the schema that we worked with a couple times during the process of building our platform out, is we'd better start documenting the decisions that we're making, because we had turnover and nobody could remember why we did the thing that we did. So we've gotten to this. We've actually gotten to a process where, as we're going through doing our work, the catalogers are actually teaching our technology folks how to document content, and our technology folks are working with our catalogers to better understand and help them understand some of the more object-y kind of things that we're working with. And then the last thing, and this is just something that I think we all are going to have to just continue to be used to, is that things will continue to be very, very, very messy. I've actually thought about, I've talked to some folks before about how long I think Mark will be around, and I'm going to be honest, I think it's going to be around longer than I am, honestly. And that's maybe not in like mainline use, but there are too many organizations right now that rely on it that literally will have no way to transform their organizations into something else. It won't happen. I work with too many small organizations that have too many technical liabilities and too much technical debt to make that transition. And so there's always going to be a necessity to be able to work with multiple formats, whether the entire library community, the large library community moves to something that looks like BibFrame. There's always going to be the need to be able to export data into multiple formats, which means there's always going to need to be a way to work with multiple formats. I'm not sure what your organizations look like, but I work with, when I work with our catalogers in our library, we work with very small foreign publishers who sometimes send MARC records, who sometimes send text files that are just like receipts that we have to turn into metadata records, that send us MARC records in character encodings that don't exist anymore. I actually have to pull the ISO formats to recreate them, that have been created in formats that live on old operating systems. We just have a lot of messy data, and there's a lot of it, and there's always going to be a lot of it. And so while I, in my local work, am moving full speed ahead, thinking about how we convert all of our data into more object-based stuff. And in fact, I did not show you this, but if you are interested in doing your own linked data work, MarcEdit's got you covered. You can start working with thinking about how you turn your MARC records from objects to strings to more objects. MarcEdit has tools, particularly the link identifiers. This tool actually will go out, and for national libraries, so particularly the national libraries I work with in the U.S., but I could add other ones, we'll link mesh headings, Getty headings, LCSH headings, name authority headings, works with VOF, works with Wikidata. All of those different things that will generate for you the URIs, following the rules that we've been setting up in the PCC. It'll create atomized records in places where I believe that fields should be broken up rather than stacking URIs and stuff like that. There's a rules file you can add to it if you want to see how it works. It's all open. In fact, that code is actually open if you're interested in seeing how it works. But there is a rules file. It's all in XML where I like it. That shows how all of the data gets worked with and all the collections. You can actually go through and start the process of doing the reconciliation needed in order to take advantage of some of these next step processes. Because I honestly think when we talk about what libraries and what cataloging looks like in the future, is it's going to look like a number of tiny steps. It really will. BibFrame represents a huge step, and there are a lot of libraries that are moving headlong into trying to see what this looks like. OCLC's got a really interesting BibFrame experiment that they're working on. A lot of libraries are trying. The Library of Congress, I think, next year will create as many BibFrame records as they create MARC records, even though they're going to create MARC records of their BibFrame. But they have as many catalogers working on BibFrame as on MARC right now. For the majority of us who work in cataloging on a regular basis, the process of moving to whatever comes next will look like a bunch of tiny steps. And those tiny steps actually start with doing the things that you can do now, which tends to be things like reconciliation and working with your ILS vendors who are actually trying to think about how they make use of this information, and finding ways to work with your local library development staff to take advantage of those data elements when you pull them out of your system. I'll be honest, most of the data that I enhance, most of the enhancements we put into our MAC records, they are most useful outside of our library catalog, because that's where we make the most use out of them. And that's what I had right straightforward. So I figured I'd have about a half an hour, and then I want to talk to you guys about what your kind of questions and concerns are, because I had thought about just sitting up here and talking to you guys about BibFrame, but I'll be honest, I don't believe in it that much right now. I mean, I believe in the concept, and I believe in the work that's being done, but I'm not sure I'm as ready to, I'll be honest, there's no way my institution could do it, and I'm an R1 institution. And I look at that, and I look at my institution, and I say, even if tomorrow we said everybody was ready and our systems were ready to convert, I think it would take us 5 to 10 years to do it. Even if all the data could be converted, because the workflows and the work that we have built around the current processes would all need to be moved to in order for us to work, or we're going to hire a lot more staff. And I can tell you we're not going to hire a lot more staff.
Do you see any way for the hosting and maintaining the namespaces to generate value? I don't want to say monetize, but for institutions to create some value out of hosting these things, for that to be some kind of sustainable.
So it's an interesting question, because OCLC is trying to figure this very question out, because they would very much like to be a network type. VOF realistically could be a switching point. In fact, that's what VOF really is good for, is being that switching point that links to all of the different vocabularies that potentially could be about that particular name. But I'm not sure OCLC knows, from their perspective, how it fits within their membership model. For other folks that work in this kind of stuff, like in the U.S., we couldn't ask people to pay for it. We aren't allowed. Library of Congress can't get back, can't have people monetize that. They can give it away. Other people can do stuff with it. But because it's part of the federal government document, it's open and in the public domain. So there's really not a way for them to do that. And then you run back into the problem of, again, these aren't national libraries. It really comes down to thinking probably differently about how we do it, which means thinking differently about how we do authority control and the process that we work with, and who's going to be, how do we build those trust relationships again? Because right now, all of our authority control is based on the fact that we think we trust the Library of Congress. At least, in my country, we think we trust them. And so, that trust relationship has to be rebuilt.
It's not a question, it's a couple of comments. One is that every library needs more like Unix as their head of technology or IT. Because I work at the British Library, and the main problem for us is that most of the IT people haven't They know nothing about Marc.
Yeah.
They know nothing about Marc and they're not interested. And yet, that one of the largest departments in the library uses Marc as its metadata format. And I think Marc is reform. I think platforms like yours, software like yours, give Marc a new lease of life because it is a great format for bulk data releasing.
Yeah.
And that you're quite right, there isn't another format out there. XML doesn't do it. And unless you're a programmer and you have a language of choice that you know about, it's the only thing that we've got. So we're the people who know about the metadata. Most of the technology guys know nothing about metadata, and that's a big problem. If we all have someone like you as head of IT in every institution, we'd have moved a lot further forward to transform our metadata.
So it is one of the things that I find interesting. It's like on the listserv. Before I came out here, there was a question about why don't we just use MarcXML? Because there's this assumption that Marc is the reason why we can't do X. And the reality is, it's the reason that the folks weren't super excited about using it is because Marc it's very different. It's not something that we learn. XML is there. It's relatively readable. But I'll be honest, even, like I said, one of the goals behind something like this is this notion that it wouldn't be just libraries building software to work with BibFrame. I don't think that happens, honestly. I've handed this off to people who are a lot smarter than I am. And without the context around the data model that's been used, it's just XML data that they'd have to sort out. I mean, they still have to sit down with somebody to figure out how in the world do we use it. Now, the fact that it's in XML or in JSON or some kind of format makes it a little bit easier to work with because there's not that domain knowledge you have to use. But I'll be honest, Marc isn't very hard to learn how to use. It's a binary format. If you've got any programming experience, you could probably learn it in an afternoon. And so it's really just, I think a lot of it is just people just don't use it enough to be able to make a good reason. And then because of that, they start to equate Marc with cataloging, and they are so far different between each other. I keep telling people, you could do BibFrame tomorrow, but unless the cataloging rules change, you're still not going to understand a word of what everybody's saying.
What was your thinking behind having MarcEdit available on the terminal, and whether that was part of it being involving programmers with working with Marc? Because as I saw, you have only 150 people using a Linux system, which probably I'm one of them.
Yeah, so I use it. So I use it on the terminal because I like to throw it on to Amazon. I have a cluster of machines when I'm working with really large data sets. And so I use the terminal version for pretty much all of that stuff. The Windows terminal version actually gets used a lot more than I realize because I've been working with a number of folks like the Smithsonian who are building some processes around it. But I did do it partly because it was really for me and hoping other people would use it because I'm just more comfortable. I rarely use the interface in MarcEdit. Even when I was a cataloger, I would write programs around it, and it was just a lot easier for me to open the terminal, hit a couple buttons, and get what I needed. And so I like to encourage other people to use it whenever they're thinking about ways of working with it, especially on Linux. It works. That's where it probably works best in there. But yeah, that was kind of the reason behind it.
Hopefully, but there must be some more documentation on the use of it.
I do have.
I think it's kind of like a big hurdle for most people who haven't even opened the terminal to.
It is, and so
look at it in that way.
I've tried to put some of that in, and I will be putting parts of it. But there's in the knowledge base, there's actually. Assuming this will actually I'm still online. Am I? Yeah, there we go. So here's using the MarcEdit terminal. There's a list of all of the commands, and then there's a small field guide I've been working on, which documents out how the terminal works with. And I've been putting stuff into that. But yeah, there is a bit more of a hurdle because less people use it. So I tend to make some assumptions around the folks who are working with it. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm kind of interested in your thoughts around that.
Well, and I do think one of the things that we have that, especially around things like RDA, that's problematic is it's not an open scheme. It's not an open standard. So, and I don't mean that by it's not an open standard. I have to pay for it in order to see it. You know, when I work with MarcEdit, I develop it completely separate from my work at the university. And I do that partly because in the United States, institutions have quirky rules about what faculty can own and not own. And so when I start working at every institution, I make sure I write it out and we figure out what the parameters are. But that means I have to pay for my own access for things. And just to work with RDA, I have to pay for access to it just to see it. And when I think about it in that concept, it's never going to be more than a library standard. It really won't. And I'm not even sure it's going to be a whole library standard, because I still work with half the libraries in Ohio that still use ACR2 because they don't have a copy of access to RDA. So yeah, it really does. I think that unfortunately, one of the things that we've made a decision with as a community, we have seemed to have made a decision that we are going to start to fragment the work that we do. We have essentially allowed libraries to live within that fragmentation by still having everybody be able to put stuff into MARC. OCLC doesn't require you to put things into RDA, so you can still get stuff in and out and work with it. But if we ever change that, where you started to stop having that, you would definitely create an environment where I just don't know how. I don't know how most of the libraries I work with be able to function. I really don't. It's one of the things I worry about a lot, is how a lot of the libraries I work with would be able to continue to serve their communities.
Right. I know I work for OCLC, but yeah, just bear with me on this. I know that this work in a cycle of buying new systems.
Yes.
Going out to the market, every 5, 7, 10 years, whatever. And I see this obviously in my work. And libraries will come along, the director will say, okay, what's sexy? Okay, we've got to do, our new system has got to support linked data, it's got to support BibFrame. And you've got checkboxes of marks.
Yep.
And your commercial library system supplier will also say, yeah, we do that. Yeah, we do that. And people kind of get suckered into it. Now, it's going to be obvious to anybody listening to you this afternoon that those commercial suppliers that say that, yes, they do that, are kind of lying through their teeth. And we're probably doing it in a small way as well. What kind of questions should the librarians be asking of their system suppliers, or rather asking maybe of their directors in terms of, what do we need to do to actually upgrade and stay?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question, because we do have some ILS vendors that are saying they'll support BibFrame, that they structure the data in BibFrame, and that's more power to them if they can. I mean, even if I was creating a system that would import data from BibFrame, I'm not sure I would structure it locally that way. I mean, most ILS systems never structure data in MARC. They break it down so that it's actually indexed in a way that makes sense. I think the kind of questions I would be asking is how, so if I had a library, if I had an ILS and our ILS system, I don't believe says they support linked data. I know I have to hide the URIs because they don't do anything with them. I'd be wanting to know what they do with them. I actually don't care if they support the ingest of them. I want to know how they're making use of that data, because that piece of information could actually solve some certain problems. So like what I'm waiting for is I'm waiting to see ILS systems or systems start making use of semantic web data to solve my authority control problems. Because right now it's all string matching, and I could solve a lot of that. I mean, we're talking real world kind of problems that it could solve. That could actually solve a lot of my authority work, because I would have an actual point that was minted that I could look up and I could change data if it changed and it was updated. It would seem like that would be a low-hanging fruit, something that I could work with. Of course, then we go back to the point that a lot of these organizations couldn't support that kind of real-time lookup. So we're back to the Library of Congress making available a data dump once every quarter, and the information being slightly out of date. But that would be the kind of thing I would be interested in. I'd be wanting to know, if a system supported linked data, does it support the ability to reconcile data itself? Because most systems should be able to reconcile large sets of large national libraries. They provide those data dumps. I should be able to update them, and I should be able to just have that system do that for me. It's really fast and simple if I can do it locally. I'd be asking, how do they make use of that information? Because there's a lot of ways that I could use that to support discovery and make discovery actually work better, as well as pull in information about a resource that would be really useful for users. And I would be asking them about how they would envision transforming my data into whatever comes next. Because I don't think that should be a new system purchase. I mean, it probably will be, the way most of our ILS systems work. But I honestly think that if we're in a position right now where anybody who says they store their data in BibFrame is going to have to convert it again. Because BibFrame is not going to look the same probably somewhere down the road, because there's still parts that we're filling in. I think the first, I think at one point, Ex Libris was supporting an Alma BibFrame 1, so they would have had to transition their data to 2. So I'd like to know what kind of plan they have for supporting that kind of data migration, because we're going to have multiple migrations as we go through if they're going to say they're going to support that as an underlying data scheme. And then I would ask what kind of data formats they support coming out, because I'm still going to have to support, I look around at the systems that my library uses, and even with the work that I do, I have multiple systems that require data to come out in Marc. They just do. It's the way that they work with other systems around our catalog, and they're not even library systems. They're systems that we've learned to interact with. So. And I would ask them what kind of APIs they have, because honestly, I'm more interested anymore with our ILS in terms of how I get data out and how I integrate with it. So I would love to, in my local ILS system, not have to extract the data all the time. I would love to be able to make use of the indexing that they have, but the reality is I don't have an API I can work with that works well enough. So I extract all my data and I work with it that way. I actually would like to be able to import data using an API, but I don't have the ability to do that. So those would be things I would be looking for.
So, do you think BibFrame is just do you think BibFrame is going to be the future, or is it not?
I think that something like BibFrame is probably going to be the future, assuming we answer some of these other questions. The concepts behind it actually make a lot of sense. So this notion that every library has to have an actual cataloged resource is very expensive, and the ability to be able to distribute that across our broader community and even outside of our community seems really, really attractive, and makes a lot of sense in the technical environment that we live in now. But the problem is, BibFrame may not be actually available and useful for maybe another 10 years, maybe. I mean, we're talking about infrastructure that needs to be developed. In 10 years, will the semantic web still look the same? I think it's going to look something, I think we're going to have something like it. The concepts behind it make a lot of sense. In an intermediary world where we're looking at small steps, we're actually moving to a more object-based approach. Even in Marc, we're trying to reconcile data and create URIs so that we can make use of that information. So there are concepts around it that make a lot of sense. Will BibFrame itself, as it looks right now, be what the final form is? I don't think so, but I think it'll look something like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, just like BibFrame 1, that's better than just we, this is one line, and BibFrame 2, that's we with 2 eyes. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Possibly a difficult question. Talking about the future of cataloging, what about the future of the catalog? And particularly training needs.
That is a really good question. So that is a really good question. So I can tell you the kind of things that we're talking about in our library in terms of things that catalogers need to become more familiar with. we actually have been encouraging staff to become more engaged with the wiki community and participating in that group. We continue to engage our staff in authority control work, traditional authority control work. We've been trying to get more of our staff to be more literate in some of the technical work and try and make some of our technical staff more literate in cataloging work, which means having them work a lot more closely together on a regular basis. Partly because whether the library community, whatever we end up doing, we work with so many different formats. Even if BibFrame is what we use today, we use Marc today. We still use dozens and dozens of different formats that we have to work with. And so there's this notion of trying to get our catalogers to be maybe a little bit more agnostic in their thinking. The other thing that I would be thinking about in terms of skills that our catalogers would have, and this isn't to denigrate anything, is to think more about cataloging sometimes as good enough. Because we have a lot of very good catalogers, and they catalog to a really high level of precision. And I think part of one of the things that catalogers could help a lot of our IT folks with is we're thinking a lot about how do we do cataloging through automated processing. And the folks who do the actual development work don't live in that domain. They have to work with our content experts, our catalogers. And so they become, to some degree, the knowledge base that helps drive that development. And so those relationships need to be more cultivated than what we have right now. But in terms of traditional skills, right now, there's not. I mean, even with what BibFrame has right now, there's not a lot of, the training that the Library of Congress goes through to get a cataloger to work in BibFrame. They're really the skills are transferable for what they do now. It's just the format's very different in terms of what they work with. But from my perspective, I would like to see more engagement with our catalogers. We are trying to engage more with our catalogers. In fact, we hired somebody in our cataloging department to be a liaison bridge between our development staff and our catalogers on site to try and help us better understand the implications of the metadata being created across all the different metadata formats, not just Marc, but EAD and all these different things, so that our developers have a better time of understanding and translating what's going on. Because they really don't understand, I don't want to say they don't care, but they don't understand. It's not their domain. And so it's really having somebody who helps be able to crosswalk the language between the two. That's actually really hard for developers working with catalogers. We have very different languages. And so, we've been trying to encourage more of that kind of bilingual development.
I was just wondering, why do you think the Library of Congress are actually training their catalogers to catalog in BibFrame? Why are they not training them to use an interface that, say, follows the BCC rules that they should be following, and the outcome is a BibFrame data set behind the scenes?
I don't know. I'm not quite sure why they do what they do, honestly. I do know that, so what I do know is, in 2011, the Library of Congress said, we're going to create an alternative to Marc, and so they've been putting resources behind that. And so right now they're in it's a 2-year pilot, where they're putting significant resources behind the development of metadata in BibFrame. They're part of the group that's testing whatever the BibFrame editor is. I know ALA, they're going to talk about how great it is and all the cool things that it does. The problem is, if you sit there and you listen to it, and I pull it down, I use it, we're starting from scratch. The things that it does is so, it can't even create new records. It only edits regular records. This is the problem that we're running into, is we're building something, we're literally starting at zero, trying to catch up with systems that do lots of different things, and it's going to take a really long time to get back to zero. The Folio project, there are people working on that I respect a lot. There were people that worked on the other project, I can't even remember its name. It was the one that preceded the Folio project that a bunch of R1s worked on. Same thing. Expect every, but they were starting from scratch, and it took 10 years, a lot of money, and they decided it wasn't going to work, and so they folded the organization and some of the thought into the Folio project. I think they're going to come out with a very nice looking, application that does really cool stuff, but it's going to do really cool stuff that is really basic stuff, and they're going to take a bunch of years to try and catch up to where I am right now. This is the problem that we have. That it's a huge lift. It's just a heavy lift to get everything, to get caught up to where we are. There's a lot of promise out there of where we want to get to, but I still don't see where in our library community who's the JFK standing there that says we're going to get to the moon in 3 years, and cost be damned, I'm going to make it work. I don't see that in our community, and I know it's not going to happen by the deans in our libraries. I just don't see that. Yeah, I think that's probably true. We tend to do. So one thing I will say that was different with the bib framework, and I do think that they did think about this a little bit. If they actually hired somebody outside of the library community to do that work, Zafira. Now they were tangentially adjacent to libraries because Eric Miller and all the folks who run Zafira used to work at OCLC. So it's not like they weren't familiar with it, but their business model actually was based on medical and medical work. And so they were working with semantic web networks that are being developed outside of the library community. But we do tend to have a general ethos of built in-house where we don't tend to work really well with a lot of folks. This is why when I'm working with the BibFrame, a lot of the BibFrame assumptions, I'm actually not asking librarians because I know what the people who work in the community will say. They're all in. I actually ask my computer scientists who have no concept of what I'm talking about to take a look at the work that we're doing to see, does it make any, could I hand this to you, will this make your work any better? And unfortunately right now I'm still getting the impression that what we're creating is a very cool niche product that I'm not quite sure is going to meet the stated goals of creating something that will allow libraries to work with vendors outside of the library community. We might, maybe it'll get there. It's a long tail of development, but where we're at right now, I'm not quite sure that happens. I do think engaging more with other communities, and I think that you do see some people in the library working really closely with the Wikidata community, although they have some of their own problems, where you're seeing people trying to engage more in those kind of fields. But it's interesting because I'm not sure that the people who are doing the development, they're very focused on getting certain work done, and I'm not quite sure how you push people in those directions. But I think what you're saying is actually a good point. We do tend to run into that a lot. And in fact, it's one of the things that drives my director crazy when we talk about like our digital platforms. We're working with Samvera and Hyrax, which are great. They're products that we've been working on for a long time. But the reality is we started from scratch and we're kind of doing everything on our own, and they've updated a couple times, and we're kind of at the mercy of the community, which kind of shifts and wobbles and moves around, and we look at these other things that other communities that are doing this stuff, the same stuff, and we can't figure out how to do it in a way that seems sustainable.
so many things. I mean, we think you said like really constantly changing environment, but it's changing very, 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 very slowly practical terms.
In practical terms, yes, I do think it's changing very slowly. If you think about, I remember sitting at DLF when the Library of Congress announced they were, when I was talking to folks who were part of the project, Library of Congress was kind of come up with an alternative for MARC, and it would be in place by 2013 or 15 or something like that. That was in 2010. I was like, good luck with that. That just seemed crazy at its face. At this point, the fact is they are creating records, but it's still a long ways away. So in that case, I actually think that that's beneficial, because what happens is libraries then can start looking at what are the incremental things they can do. And I really do think there are incremental things you should be doing. The reconciliation work has to happen. OCLC could actually help an awful lot with that by doing it and allowing everybody to re-download the records and not have to do the reconciliation yourself. But there is a lot of stuff that you can be doing right now that actually has tangible benefit if you happen to pull your records in and out of your systems, or if an ILS ever got around to thinking about saying, I could use those URIs for authority control. That would actually be really useful. But yeah, practically, libraries tend to move slowly in a lot of things, and I think this is one of those where we'll take some time.
Look, I think, really kind of when we were developing RDA, kind of like halfway through, kind of like started integrating kind of like the kind of big data, kind of semantic web kind of thing. But then I think that's like the main, the big frame was the sense of drag like to match the schema a bit. Mm-hmm. And then the kind of big frame 2 was trying to make it be still a little bit schema, but be fit a bit more with Lenny model, which is like,
yeah.
And then it's the thing is, because it's taken so long to get to RDA, if you're scaling back to something with schema compatible or something else with schema, and how long the schema must be quite robust to the standard, is it?
Well, that's what OCLC uses, schema.org. To be honest, if the library community was serious about interoperability with other communities, we probably would have invested more in helping to bring schema.org along rather than developing something ourselves. Honestly, that would have been the better. Well, actually we gave up because we were looking at, so we wanted to make sure everything we could put in MARC could fit inside of it, and that's not going to happen. All right, I think we're, yeah.
I could just thank Terry again for giving up his time to speak to us today. I think as chair of SIG, the last session of this has been very, very interesting to me, because at the moment SIG are looking at trying to do a survey later in the year to look at what's being taught in the library schools and how that fits with the overall vision and evolution of the technical strands of the profession. So how we can provide a technical pathway for people who are either already doing the work and want to move with it, or maybe are in another area and want to move into this area. So what you've said there is really, really interesting, and I think gives us an awful lot of food for thought. So thank you for that. That was really brilliant. In terms of the day, I'd like to also thank Professor Charlie Inskip from the Department of Information Studies here at UCL for the use of the facility. I'd like to thank OCLC for providing the refreshments. And I'd like to thank you all for turning up and engaging with these really, really fundamentally important topics. And Terry is always very approachable. I know some of you already correspond with him regarding the use of MarcEdit. And I hope that the professional association in this country will again be able to pick your brains at various points and talk about things like the curricula that we need to have in place to support the production, the creation, the maintenance, the enrichment of metadata now and also in the future.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
Great stuff. I'll just log off there.
so it's exam time for everybody right now? I wasn't sure what your guys' time was.